How can I talk to my child?
My students need help.
I really need to talk to somebody. Is this normal?
I don't know how to respond.
What am I supposed to do?
Surely there's training somewhere to handle this.
Hello, I'm Robert Rabin, and I'm privileged to serve as the president of National Center for Youth Issues. Today's topic is the prevention of suicide in our schools and communities. We're privileged today to have with us Dave Opalewski, and Dave has spent a good part of his career addressing these types of issues in schools and communities throughout our country. Dave is the president of Grief Recovery in Saginaw, Michigan, and is a certified death and dying and suicide prevention instructor for Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. He is also a certified support group facilitator and child trauma specialist. Dave was involved in K-12 education for 33 years, 25 of those years as a classroom teacher, and 8 of those years as an at-risk counselor and coordinator at a school district also in Michigan. Dave worked for 3 years as an aftercare consultant at a funeral home. During that time, he pioneered the Saginaw County Aftercare Adult Support Group. He is the author of 4 books that address the issues of suicide and grief, including the one that we'll be referencing today, which is Confronting Death in the School Family. Dave's books are published by the National Center for Youth Issues, and he has also published several articles in professional journals. He is a highly sought-after speaker at both state level and national conferences and has conducted numerous workshops in school districts throughout our country. Dave is currently a full-time instructor at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I've had the privilege of getting to know Dave over the last several years, and I quickly recognized his passion for the work that he has been called to do. Dave, welcome to NCYI. It's good to see you again, and I'm glad you could join us today. We're going to be talking about an issue that's of grave concern to schools and communities throughout the country.
Robert, it's an honor and a privilege to be here to discuss one of the fastest growing killers of the most precious resource we have in our country, our children.
Well, Dave, let's just dive right into some questions on this issue. Can you give us some insight into the extent of the suicide epidemic in our country?
Well, Robert, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta states that suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among adolescents in our country today. But many experts say take the known number of suicides and multiply it by 4, and some even say 4.5. And that's the actual number of suicides we have in our country today with adolescents. The Michigan Association of Suicidology did some research, and they claim that suicide is a common thought to 62% of United States adolescents. And from 1994 to 2004, suicide increased 124% in our middle schools in our country. And within a typical classroom, in that same research that the Michigan Association of Suicidology did, they found out that in a typical classroom, it's likely that in the past year, 2 girls and 1 boy have made a suicide attempt in the last year. Experts also claim that 1 out of every 10 students in a typical middle and high school in the United States is clinically depressed. So if we take an average school of 1,200 students, that means they have 120 clinically depressed students walking their hallways. Only 1 in 5 get help, which means we have in excess of 95 students walking around in these schools, these typical schools, who are clinically depressed and not getting help. The American Psychiatric Association claims that these students who are clinically depressed and not getting help are at a 14 times greater risk of making a suicide attempt. The CDC also reports that 14 adolescents lose their lives to suicide every day in our country. Well, if we take 14 and multiply it by 4.5, which experts say we need to do, that means we have 63 adolescents dying every day in our country by suicide. Another staggering number is that for every completion. It represents 100 suicide attempts. And if that's true, and I believe it is, we have 6,300 adolescents making a suicide attempt every day in our country.
Dave, those numbers are indeed staggering. And so let's go a little further and let's talk about some of the other issues related to suicide and its prevention. Dave, what are some of the common myths about suicide?
Well, Robert, there's many common myths, and there's three that really frustrate me. And the first one is talking about suicide will make it happen. The National Association of Suicidology said in their national convention in 2001, they drafted a statement that said, suicide is a national health epidemic. The number one preventative measure is to talk about it. Now, this is a group of professionals, and I think it's very interesting to note that they didn't say the number one preventative measure was Prozac or Zoloft. And I visited a school district in another state that had 10 suicides in the same high school in 7 months. And I came in one evening and did a community forum in which 800 parents attended and 300 students. After I was done with the forum, I was driving back to my motel and I stopped at a Dairy Queen about 2 blocks away from the auditorium. I walked in and there were about 20 youth in booths. And they saw me walk in and they got out of their booths and circled me. And at first I thought I was going to get beat up until one girl showed me her arm. And it said, "Save me from myself." It was all scarred and healed over. And another boy showed me a lacerated tricep muscle. And they talked about the 10 students who died. They were their friends. And they told me about their own struggles with depression. And I asked them, what was the most important thing I said all evening? And if you've ever worked with students, they'll look at each other and they'll say, "I'll say this if you say this. I'll say this if you say this." None of them looked at each other. And they all looked at me and they said, "We want to talk about it." The number one preventative measure is to talk about it. We're not putting ideas in their heads by addressing the situation. The number two myth, youth who talk about it rarely attempt it. Research shows that a person who makes a suicide attempt has told between 2 and 3 people. So we have to take them seriously if they're talking about suicide. The third myth is once a person's been suicidal, they're never out of trouble. Well, a few years back, I got a phone call from a girl, and I knew something was wrong right away when I answered the telephone. Well, she was calling me from her cell phone and asphyxiating herself at that time in her parents' garage. I was fortunate enough to convince her to turn the car off and get out of the garage until EMS arrived. Well, last year, which is 4 years later, I got a postcard from her. And she was graduating from college as an RN, and she was getting married. So they do get better.
Yeah, that's great.
They do get better. And the next myth is that national suicide prevention programs are effective. Research shows they're not effective. We can't buy canned programs to prevent suicide. The most effective prevention programs are the ones that start at the grassroots levels in every community.
Mm-hmm. Dave, thank you for sharing those valuable insights. If I might ask you this, what are some typical comments that adults make to suicidal teens?
Well, first of all, I want to say, Robert, that these adults mean well. They don't mean harm. But there's typically 4 things adults say to, especially adolescents who are in suicidal crisis. The first thing they'll say is, "These are the best years of your life." Well, if these are the best years of my life and I'm depressed, you just told me things aren't going to get any better. You didn't give me any hope for the future. The second thing adults will say to an adolescent is, "You have your whole life ahead of you." And that has the same effect as the first thing they usually say is, "These are the best years of your life." Another thing adults will say is, they'll say, well, you know, if you think you have problems now, young man, you just wait till you get a job and you have demands from a boss and you get married and you have children, you have bills to pay. You think you have problems now? Well, that's the same thing. We're not giving hope. And the fourth and most dangerous thing we will say is, well, just go ahead and do it. Reverse psychology is a bad idea. If I'm depressed and I'm sharing with someone close to me that I'm thinking of taking my life, and they say, well, just go ahead and do it, thinking they're going to scare me out of it, it's not going to do it. It's not a scare tactic. It's a dare tactic is what it is. It's a dare tactic. And it's going to make me feel worse and possibly feeling guilty for being depressed. A person using a scare tactic such as reverse psychology is very, very dangerous because, first of all, how would you feel if that person took your advice?
Dave, thank you for reminding us how careful we have to be when using words and working with vulnerable youth. And I noticed that you used the word completed suicide, not committed suicide. Can you explain to me why?
Well, Robert, I learned from my SOS support groups. SOS stands for Survivors of Suicide. And I've had several of those support groups, and whenever I used the word committed, I noticed they would cringe, or they would kind of look at me like there was some anxiety or they were offended. So one day I just asked them, is there something wrong with what I said? And one girl in the group said, you know, Mr. O, people commit bank robberies. People commit murder. What crime did our loved one who died by suicide commit? So they taught me that I was actually offending them by using the word committed. So we discussed a more sensitive word to use, and we came up with completed. That completed suicide is much more sensitive to the survivors than committed suicide, because people commit crimes. And suicide is a result of a person, number one, being depressed, which we now know is a medical condition, or mentally ill.
Well, Dave, in working with these support groups, do you find that grief from suicide is different than grief from death of other causes?
Well, Robert, there's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences as well. First of all suicides are sudden death, and we know that sudden death creates a tremendous shock and trauma in people as well. Suicides tend to be violent deaths as well, and it's very traumatic, especially if you find the victim after the suicide attempt was made and completed. I notice as I work with people that they have what I call the I could have, should have, would have syndrome. You know, I could have done this, I should have known this, I should have done that, and that produces a tremendous amount of guilt. So I notice much more guilt in these situations where a suicide occurs than death from other causes. Also, what I notice is that a lot of the survivors feel like they were rejected by the person who took his life. And that rejection is very strong and very powerful, much more so than death from other causes.
Well, Dave, this concludes our interview, and I want to thank you for being with us today and sharing your insights and expertise on this very sensitive and timely topic. And we hope to see you again soon, my friend.
Well, Robert, you're welcome. And as I said before, it's been an honor and a privilege.
Well, thank you for joining us today. And as we wrap up, I'd like to summarize some of the points that we've learned in our interview with Dave. Suicide is the fastest growing killer of U.S. adolescents. Suicide is the number 2 cause of death for U.S. adolescents. There are many myths about suicide. Education is the key to dispelling these myths. Suicide is preventable. Experts claim the number 1 preventative measure of suicide is to address the issue. Suicide prevention education must be made available to parents, all youth caretakers, and adolescents to stop this fast-growing epidemic. Community efforts rather than national programs prove to be more effective in prevention. If you are interested in bringing Dave to your community or reviewing the resources that he has developed, please select the appropriate icon shown on the screen, or you may contact us at 1-800-477-8277. Thank you again for joining us.